name is Cara O'Sullivan, and I serve the Boston College Clough School of Theology and Ministry as Assistant Director of Continuing Education. Thanks to all joining us today, both in person and online, for this 6th event in our Spring 2025 Continuing Education Lecture Series. As part of the school's mission, we offer an array of enrichment opportunities to foster Christian faith and promote lifelong learning. We do this with on-campus presentations like this one, as well as online courses, webinars, videos, and other resources for personal enrichment and professional development. I want to take a moment to mention that next Thursday, May 1st, we'll hold our annual Women in Theology and Ministry Lecture. This is our final event of the semester. We invite you to join us as Boston College Theology Department Professor Emerita M. Sean Copeland offers the lecture, The Synod, the Spirit, and Women in Ministry. These event flyers are available at the entrance to this room, so be sure to pick up a copy on your way out. For those of us joining us remotely, we'll share the event details with you in a follow-up email. We hope you can join us. The Boston College Bookstore is here with copies of our speaker's book available for sale, Getting Involved with God, Rediscovering the Old Testament. So please be just sure to check out the bookstore table as well. Thanks to our speaker for granting us permission to videotape this presentation, including the conversation portion. We're so grateful for the opportunity to extend the life of this lecture. Within about a month, you'll find the video posted on our YouTube channel. During this program, there'll be an opportunity for questions and conversation, and there are just 2 points to keep in mind. First, before you ask a question or make a comment, please wait for the microphone so the video can pick it up. One of our graduate students, Grace Ann or Matt, will bring a microphone to you. And second, please know that if you do ask a question or make a comment, it will likely be part of the final video and might have a long shelf life. So just be sure you're okay with that before speaking. For those joining us virtually, we encourage you to post questions and comments using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. My colleague James will be able to share your comments with our speaker and the in-person audience during the Q&A portion of the presentation. Finally, we're also able to offer live closed captioning for today's event. You'll notice a closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen to enable or disable the feature. Many thanks to Francesca, graduate student here at the Clough School, for assisting with the closed captioning for us today. Now I invite Father Michael McCarthy, Dean of the Clough of the School of Theology and Ministry, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's presentation, The Poetry of Care and Loss. This lecture is in honor of our esteemed colleague, Richard J. Clifford of the Society of Jesus, and it is made possible through the generous support of the Kitts family. We're delighted that both Father Clifford and Anne-Marie Kitts were able to join us here today. And I want to especially thank Anne-Marie and the whole Kitts family for their real extraordinary dedication to the Clough School of Theology and Ministry here at Boston College. Would you please join me in giving a thank you to Anne-Marie? It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Ellen F. Davis is Amos Reagan Kern's Distinguished Professor of Bible and Practical Theology at Duke Divinity School. A native Californian, as I am too, especially welcome. Professor Davis holds a Ph.D. from Yale University and also holds degrees from the University of California at Berkeley, the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, Oxford University, as well as 4 honorary degrees. She arrived at Duke in 2001, having previously taught at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, Yale Divinity School, and Virginia Theological Seminary. In 2010, Professor Davis received Duke's Outstanding University Scholar and Teacher of the Year Award. In 2015 and 16, she served as the interim dean of the Divinity School. The author of 12 books and many articles, Her research interests focus on how biblical interpretation bears on the life of faith communities and their response to urgent public issues, particularly the ecological crisis and interfaith relations. Her most recent books are Preaching the Luminous Word, a collection of her sermons and essays, and Opening Israel's Scriptures, a comprehensive theological reading of the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament, Light Within Light, Psalms and the Arts of Insight, co-written with Makoto Fujimura and Shai Held, and that is forthcoming from Baylor University in 2026. A lay Episcopalian, she has long been active as a theological consultant within the Anglican Communion. Her current work explores the arts as modes of scriptural interpretation. We are delighted to host her here tonight at the Klaus School of Theology and Ministry. Please join me in welcoming Professor Davis.
Thank you very much, Dean McCarthy, and thank you all for coming. It is an honor to give this lecture in honor of a distinguished colleague whose name I have heard many times, but I think not previously met, and the Reverend Dr. Richard Clifford. So it's a great pleasure, and this is my first visit to Boston College. Again, a place I have heard much of over decades, and I'm delighted to be on your beautiful campus. This evening, I will speak about poetry, both biblical poetry, specifically the Psalms, and also the poetry of two modern New Englanders, poets who express care for the world that God has made and a sense of responsibility to it and for it. I choose this topic because we live in a time of carelessness and contempt for the created order. Now, for the first time, carelessness and contempt practiced on a global scale and enshrined in global economics and politics, currently nowhere more firmly entrenched and enshrined than in our own country, to our shame. Accordingly, I will also be attentive to the reality of transgression and loss, as, of course, are the psalmists themselves. One of the traditional functions of poetry is to help us discover and keep our proper place in the world, both individually and corporately. By keeping our proper place, I am speaking not of social location, which is perhaps arbitrarily assigned by some groups to others, but rather I'm speaking of the proper God-given place of the human species within the created order. Keeping one's place surely begins with keeping in health the particular and varied places that we embodied creatures physically occupy. Conversely, when we have lost our place, poetry may give us words for lamenting our loss and even help us to replace ourselves by God's grace. In this lecture, I highlight a poetic strain reaching back into antiquity that I call the poetry of care and loss, in order to illumine a cultural disposition that is diametrically opposed to contemporary industrialization, which is in fact not a culture at all. For the word culture denotes a form of social organization that connects people and places in ways that persist through time, generation to generation, as the psalmist says. By that criterion, industrialization fails miserably, with its characteristic practices of heedless waste for short-term pleasure, resulting in the displacement of humans, the depredation and extinction of non-human creatures. These poems represent a millennia-long tradition of praise and lament, which did not originate with the Psalms, but became memorable through them. It expresses a cultural commitment to honoring beloved places, to caring for them, or, when need be, lamenting their destruction. A generation or two ago, it may have been relatively uncommon for poets to write in response to the places they inhabit. Modern poets tended to favor what Dorothy Sayers once called poetry of search over poetry of statement. Maybe it even seemed safer to write about what I, a poet, personally am wishing for than it was to make truth claims about what God does, what God intends, as best we can discern it. But in fact, the psalmists often do write poems of statement about how God has ordered the world. And so do the two contemporary poets I'll be treating this evening, Anne Porter and Mary Oliver, both now of blessed memory. I am certain that they would have said that they were able to write as they did because the Psalms exist. A good poem, as Wendell Berry has said, is the product of a convocation. It represents multiple voices, with each new recitation adding its own fresh contribution to a culture that remains vital and coherent through time. This is strikingly true of the biblical Psalms, which, as you know, are not isolated works of genius, but rather traditional compositions whose forms were largely inherited, passed down through generations in the ancient Near East and Israel. In this, they resemble Eastern Orthodox icons, which are likewise tradition-laden representations of the world as it appears from the perspective of eternity. The Psalms, one might say, are the cultural icons in that strong sense of the Bible. If these recent poets are indebted to the Psalms for giving them a voice, they repay that debt with fresh articulations of the cultural perspective that informs those ancient poems of care and loss. In short, the modern poets, Mary Oliver and Anne Porter, they clarify what is at stake in the Psalms. Considered as a whole, that book, in Hebrew called Tehillim, praisings. Tehillim is exploring the conditions for offering authentic and convincing praise in a pain-racked world falling daily toward death. I begin this lecture in each case with the contemporary poet and work backwards, calling upon her to illumine, indirectly for the most part, dimensions of the Psalms we might otherwise overlook, fail to understand, or perhaps actively dislike. These particular poets are unusually forthcoming about why they write the kind of poetry they do, and what they want their readers to do with it. This is an essential service for those of us who may not be skilled or comfortable in reading poetry. Here I'm thinking of many of my own students, or tend to regard poetry as simply decorative speech, possibly overdone and often incomprehensible. Insofar as Porter and Oliver help us reckon with a body of liturgical poetry that lies at the heart of the church's life, their service may be essential for our healing as a generation. Reading the poetry of care and loss with attention to the phenomena of tradition and deeply rooted culture. Paradoxically, this could assist us in acquiring certain new habits of seeing and valuing the world. Warning. Such new habits, if we choose to adopt them, they will come hard, because the industrialized system in which we are all still entangled sets us fundamentally at odds with traditional modes of perception and evaluation. But there is motivation and intrinsic reward for seeking our freedom. Theologian Bernd Vanenwetsch aptly defines tradition as a form of agreement of which we want to be a part. We should indeed want to be a part of the cultural tradition of care for what is endangered, and mourning for what is lost. For the simple reason that such a cultural tradition is foundational to any healthful future we might seek for generations to come, our own children, grandchildren, students, and the world that we love. If indeed this tradition of praise and lament can contribute to our healing, that is because the poets working within it are aware of themselves as creatures. The task of healing is to respect oneself as a creature, no more and no less, says Wendell Berry. The poetry of care and loss is the poetry of creatures. And this is a reward for those of you who have labored over Latin and Greek through the years. I'm sure there are many of you here. So I'm going to use grammatical terms for a moment. In that phrase, the poetry of creatures, creatures is both a subjective and objective genitive. Dig it. Okay. That is, every poet within the tradition is a creature giving voice to other creatures. And at the same time, she is among, not above, the creatures of whom she writes. Thus, Anne Porter takes on the role of translator for the Rosa humilis, the pasture rose, who gives free and for nothing her prickles, her petals, and her golden eye. And so to thank her, I try to learn that dialect of silence, which is her language, and then translate it into human words. As if the Lord had told me, listen to the rose, be the voice of the rose. hold on to that phrase, dialect of silence. We'll return later to the idea of learning from the silence of non-human creatures. Porter consistently translates the creatures with notes of praise, following her spiritual and poetic model, St. Francis. Give praise with psalms that tell the trees to sing, she writes, and with the little peepers when they fill the marsh with a shimmer of bell-like cries. Porter makes audible those, quote, smallest creatures who do not know that they have names, as they praise the moist ground and every winking leaf, and the new sun that smells of the new streams. This time of year. Like the psalmists, Porter gives praise with thunderstorms, with sun and moon, with stars glittering in the dark of steepest heaven, their brimming drops of light so fresh and clear that when you look at them, it quenches thirst. It's a great line. When we encounter psalms of creaturely praise in the liturgy, speaking for myself, we might pay them little or no mind. Yet Porter, a committed Roman Catholic, reveals how difficult and intriguing is the project of interpreting non-human lives that, in contrast perhaps to our beloved pets, non-human lives that seem utterly unlike and indifferent to our lives. Porter is kin to the poet of Psalm 104, who somehow knows that when lions roar, they are asking God for food. Or that the trees of Adonai, the trees of the Lord, are sated, yispa'u in Hebrew, are sated by what God provides. And the poet uses that very same word, yispa'u, to describe how animate creatures, humans included, are sated with God's goodness. A parallel that unfortunately translations of the Psalms too often obscure. The psalmist's own interpretations of non-human lives are playful, but still consequential. For instance, a fantasia psalm, such as Psalm 96, shows a non-human world animate with praise. The field and everything in it exalts. The trees of the forest ring with joy. Again, the confines around what we call the natural world burst open in Psalm 29 as the Lebanon dances to the forest breaking Kol Adonai, voice of the Lord, heard in a late winter storm. As the wilderness convulses, does go into early labor, and in his heichal, the heavenly palace or the temple, all of it, kulo, says glory. Heaven, nature, and cult are not separate spheres of reality. All are electric with God's glory. A similar convergence of the natural and the sacred is evident as Anne Porter attends to fire. Again, she's a Franciscan. The fire that now sings in the storm and also blooms on the highest of high altars and under the vagrant's pot. Fire, she calls it the most beautiful of flowers, whose only perfume is brightness. Anne Porter became a public poet only in old age and widowhood. There's hope here. She began writing poetry in earnest at the age of 64, following the death of her husband, the painter Fairfield Porter. Anne Porter published her first book at age 83, and it became a National Book Award finalist. Her second book appeared in 2006 when she was 95. Because she lived just 1 month short of a full century and did not lose her grasp of language, Porter offers testimony out of deep and sometimes painful memory of what she calls another world, where the streams were clear, the forests all around us were deep and strong, and few believed that nature could be wounded. Note that Porter uses nature as a proper noun. For her, it's a personal name for what the psalmists call Ma'aseh Yedei Elohim, the works of the hands of God. This poem, In Another World, points obliquely to our culpable ignorance, a reality that makes our praise no less difficult than it is necessary. Human culpability also informs her poem, Leave-Taking. It's a hymn of thanksgiving that she wrote in preparation for her own death, knowing it couldn't be far off. But the poem contains also a poignant petition. I thank you for that secret praise which burns in every creature. And I ask you to bring us to life out of every sort of death, and teach us mercy. And teach us mercy. That concluding line discloses the only thing that may impede the natural creaturely impulse to praise as long as we have life. Our deadly, death-dealing lack of mercy. Again, I hear a link with the psalmist's logic, Psalm 104, a song of praise for the wide panoply of creaturely life. The psalmist seems almost oblivious of human distinctiveness until the very end of that lengthy psalm, when praise ends abruptly with the plea that sinners be finished off from the earth and the wicked until they are no more. And let all God's creatures say, Amen. I close our study of Porter with lines from one more poem, a short testament, a poignant expression of complicity, helplessness, and hope. The whole thing is a prayer. Whatever harm I may have done in all my life, in all your wide creation, if I cannot repair it, and where there are lives I may have withered around me, or lives of strangers far and near that I've destroyed in blind complicity, and if I cannot find them, or have no way to serve them, remember them. I beg you to remember them. When winter is over and all your unimaginable promises burst into song on death's bare branches. Porter's Testament has an ancient precursor in Psalm 65, which rises out of silence to articulate a profound confession of corporate sin. So I'm going to begin with those opening lines, which oddly are rarely translated in the way that seems most obvious with the Hebrew. L'cha dumiati la. To you, silence is praise, O God, in Zion, and to you vows are paid. I admit that I did not check the most common Roman Catholic translations, but it's shockingly common for that first line to be rendered, to you praise is fitting, okay? Which is actually kind of hard to get to from the Hebrew, but where there's a strong enough will, there's a way, I suppose. So, to you, silence is praise, O God in Zion, and to you vows are paid. O you who hear prayer, shomer tefillah, unto you all flesh comes. Wrongful words, or it's dvarim, wrongful words, wrongful deeds, overwhelm me, our transgressions. It is you who atone for them. The plural pronoun, our crimes, psha'enu, it's telling. The confession of sin implicates a whole community, potentially every one of us. The rest of the psalm would seem to be the praise that comes out of silence and therefore is fitting to God. A hymn to the God who answers us justly with awe-inspiring works. Verse 6, notably God's works of creation in the beginning. He sets mountains in place by his strength and his ongoing creatio continua. Here the theme of God's continually renewed creation takes a form that is entirely unique in the Bible. A close-up of God the farmer. I'll read it to you. You visit the earth and water it, abundantly you enrich it. God's stream full of water, you set their grain, just so you set it. Drenching its furrows, settling its hillocks, you soften it with showers, its growth you bless. You crown the year with your goodness, and your wagon tracks drip richness. But I've skipped a portion, sorry. So God sets the mountains in place, hechin, this very same word that describes God watering the furrows, pressing the hillocks firm, blessing growth, with the same setting the seed in its seed heads, with the happy result that God's own wagon tracks drip richness. I love that line. As God drives home, presumably, through hillside pastures, clothed with flocks, they shout out. They even sing. What begins as confession of God addressed to God in Zion concludes with a picture of the immediate and essential source of Zion's blessing, the fertile but very fragile agrarian landscape surrounding Jerusalem. As the divine farmer, presumably both sweating and dirty, in God's own person, serves as a model, a mirror to the Iron Age, an icon for the Iron Age population of Israelite small farmers for whom this poem was written. In God, they see this picture of God, they see their own earthy, everyday work as itself an essential aspect of God's nochaot, God's awesome work. Thus, it gives them a vision of their own work of imitatio Dei, their own cooperation in God's continuing work of creation. We turn now to Mary Oliver, another poet who listens beyond the confines of human language and thus develops, as she puts it, the multiple sympathies that permit entry into the other kingdom of creatures. She also has a poem about stars. The night sky leads her to a humble, though not sniveling, meditation on the tiny noises of human language. How can I hope to be friends with the hard white stars whose flaring and hissing are not speech, but a pure radiance? How can I hope to be friends with the yawning spaces between them where nothing ever is spoken? Tonight, at the edge of the field, I stood very still and looked up and tried to be empty of words. The majestic wordlessness of the heavens is, of course, the very thing that impressed the poet of Psalm 19. Although they have no words or language and their voices are not heard, their sound has gone out into all lands and their message to the ends of the world. Looking up at the stars carries Oliver beyond words, and at the very same time it grounds her, gives her, the poet, a place to stand. What can we do but keep on breathing in and out, modest and willing, and in our places? Listen, listen, I'm forever saying. Listen to the river, to the hawk, to the hoof, to the mockingbird, to the jack in the pulpit. Then I come up with a few words, like a gift. Like an ancient sailor or a mystic of any age, the poet of the province lands finds her position by reading the heavens. Oliver situates herself relationally as much as geographically, and those two are ultimately inseparable. Modest and willing, relationally, and in our places, geographically as well as relationally, we recognize that having a place among the creatures is not a right, but rather a gift and a responsibility. Such is the insight of the Israelite poet who wrote these next lines. Like Oliver, wrote them after standing very still and looking upward. I'm reading now from Psalm 8, not the whole psalm, but I'm reading from the Book of Common Prayer translation, and I choose that because that is what Mary Oliver herself would have used as a parishioner at St. Mary of the Harbor in Provincetown. What is man that you should be mindful of him? The Son of Man that you should seek him out? You have made him but little lower than the angels. You adorn him with glory and honor. You gave him mastery over the works of your hands. You put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, even the wild beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, and whatever walks in the paths of the sea. O Lord, our governor, how exalted is your name in all the world. Being fully human means standing among the earthly creatures and at the same time standing coram Deo before God. Mary Oliver is aware of that no less than the psalmist. In many poems, she reflects on what it is to have a human mind and heart, to live with eyes open to the world. And her late poems increasingly identify that disposition with prayer itself. The physicality of the religious poet should not be taken idly, she cautions. The physicality of the religious poet should not be taken idly. She or he who loves God will look most deeply into his works. Oliver can help us appreciate the sensibility that underlies this psalm, a psalm that scandalizes many ecologically minded contemporary readers who view it as a primitive apologetic for human domination, an outdated prayer that currently has no positive religious value, if it ever did. A more accurate reading, I would suggest, and I think Mary Oliver would back me up on this, a more accurate reading is to see Psalm 8 functioning in the same way as a number of ancient Near Eastern inscriptions, namely to identify oneself publicly as a devotee of a particular deity. So the verbal frame around this psalm, it opens and closes with these lines, O Lord, our governor, how exalted is your name in all the world. That frame marks this psalm off on either side as a formal declaration of religious loyalty to the sovereign of the whole created order. Lord, our governor, how exalted is your name in all the world. Further insight into Psalm 8 comes from ancient Mesopotamian iconography, such as these Assyrian cylinder seals from the 9th to 7th centuries before the Common Era. It's possible, even likely, that a poet in Assyrian-dominated Israel and Judah was familiar with seal images such as these. The gesture depicted, and I'll give you closer images. So the gesture depicted the foot of a godlike creature, a winged creature, placed on the antelope in the face of the attacking lion. This indirectly evokes the language of the psalm. You have put all things under his feet. The seals underscore the fact that for weaker or domesticated animals, such as the sheep and oxen mentioned in our psalm, the human is a user of animal life, yes, and equally a protector of animal life. And in the latter sense, as these cylinder seals suggest, in the latter sense, an agent of God, exactly as is indicated by the first chapter of the Bible, when humans are charged to exercise skilled mastery amongst the creatures, amongst the creatures, not, as it's generally rendered, over them. I would read that bait as a bait of accompaniment. The biblical poets and the Assyrian iconographer all belong to a once widespread tradition, a religious, philosophical, and artistic tradition, sometimes called the Great Chain of Being. Its central insight is that human life has an essential vertical dimension. We are lower than divinity and higher than the animals, as the psalmist says, and that we are bound both directions, above and below, bound in relationships of responsibility and care. We humans are humane only to the extent that we are answerable in our relations to what is above us and what is below. And even the non-human creatures can reach fulfillment only as we become fully human. The 7th century Greek theologian Leontius of Neapolis expressed it thus: "The creation does not venerate the Maker directly and by itself, but it is through me that the heavens declare the glory of God. Through me the moon worships God, and it is through me that the stars glorify him. Through me the waters and showers of rain, the dew and all creatures venerate God and give him glory." Granted, there is room for self-deception here, beyond what Leontius himself could have imagined 14 centuries ago. But what is at stake theologically in the claim that he is making? What is at stake is the fullness of God's glory. As we have heard from the psalmist, "O Lord, our governor, how exalted is your name in all the world." The poet of Psalm 148 orchestrates the praise of God by running through the whole chain of being, top to bottom, starting with praise from all you angels of his, sun and moon and stars, and then ending praise the Lord from the earth, mountains and all hills, fruit trees and all cedars, wild beasts and all cattle, creeping things, winged birds, kings of the earth and all peoples. Terence Fretheim aptly calls this symbiosis in praise. Every element of all God's creation is called to praise together. And given the depth of their interrelatedness, the response of one will affect the response of the other. Thus, Terence Fretheim. We'll close now with Mary Oliver's own articulation of the chain of being. It's a long poem. I'll just read excerpts, both sensuous and deeply theological. A reflection on Psalm 145, "On thy wondrous works I will meditate." She is seeking, as she reflects on that psalm, she seeks to locate God's body within the material order. So, she says, it's not hard to understand where God's body is. It is everywhere and everything. Shore and the vast fields of water, the accidental and the intended, over here, over there, and I bow down, participate and attentive. It is so dense and apparent. But Oliver remains still unsatisfied, a question in her mind. Where do you suppose is his pale and wonderful mind? So that question leads Oliver to name her aspiration, to be God's mind's servant, loving with the body's sweet mouth, its kisses, its words, everything. Every morning I want to kneel down on the golden cloth of the sand and say some kind of musical thanks for the world that is happening again, another day. I want to be worthy of what? Glory? Yes, unimaginable glory. O Lord of melons of mercy, though I am not ready, not worthy, I am climbing toward you. Here there is no false humility, but rather a painstaking upward movement. The chain of being is a ladder leading toward glory. It can be safely used only by those who kneel down in the sand and then put their foot to the rungs of gratitude, imagination, genuine humility, and exquisite care for the material order. O Lord of melons of mercy, though I am not ready, nor worthy, I am climbing toward you. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It exceeded my already high expectations, so I really appreciate it. I'm really curious what your spiritual practice is, and if it has to do with poetry.
What my spiritual practice is?
Yes, your prayer practice.
I'm supposed to be back here. Okay. I mean, really, my main prayer practice is Book of Common Prayer. You know, I mean, that's pretty. And of course, I read scripture generally in Hebrew, and so yes, it has to do with poetry because I'm reading Psalms. Generally, I'm usually hearing them in English if I'm praying in community, reading them in Hebrew at the same time. So yes, that would. And as far as my own reading, I often find at the end of a day when I'm tired, I can take in poetry better than I can take in prose. And I admit that, I mean, I find Anne Porter, Mary Oliver, pellucid. I mean, it's just so clear. This is very welcome at the end of a day. So.
I have two questions. One is when will your translation of the Psalms come out?
So I did it.
I didn't know that, but I'm asking.
Yeah. So I did it for the publication of the first ever Duke University hymnal. Go Duke. This is the. And so this is our centenary year. And I think it will come out in early 26, and it will be published in, so it's going to be a tremendous hymnal, actually, and it will be published with, I don't know what the title will be outside of the university, but it'll have a general publication. And then Mako Fujimura, you heard that Mako and I we have a book coming out next year, but that's just 12 or 15 psalms, but he is painting his way through the Psalter, and that's how I began translating the Psalms, working with him. But he paints one psalm a month, and there are 150 of them, so we've got a way to go. And but I've finished my translations, and I've said, so if it's published posthumously, I'm all right with that. And but we do have a 10-year contract on that with Yale University Press, so don't hold your breath.
My other question is, have you lived with Robert Alter's translations of the Hebrew Bible much?
Well, Robert Alter was my teacher, and so I'm sure that, no, I would not say I'm generally reading the Psalms myself in Hebrew, and as I say, hearing them through Book of Common Prayer. So, I mean, of course, I I've consulted it many times, and years ago I was asked to translate the Psalter, and I said there'd be no reason to. My teachers translated it. It just wouldn't, my translation principles are not so different from my teachers. There was no point until, and the reason I did it is because, with all due respect, it doesn't scan, it doesn't chant. It's not what he's trying to do. He hasn't written it for public recitation. And so, but I go to Duke Chapel, and so it needs to be something, and there's a big choir up there singing the psalm. It needs to be something that scans. And so that's really what moved me to do it. But of course, I looked at Robert Alter and a number of other translations, and I didn't consult the Book of Common Prayer too much because it's kind of in my guts, and I didn't, I figured it would creep in there, but I didn't want to overdo it. So,
thank you for your lecture here, for adding beauty to God's creation. I just had a question. So some of the Psalms are about lament, and you lamented a little bit about industrialization and the way we've destroyed God's creation. I was wondering if you have any suggestions about lament, about the way we treat animals on our factory farms that supply almost all of our food. And so is there any lament poetry that talk about animals and their suffering at human hands?
I'm inclined to receive what you've just said more as comment than as question, because I think it's a very apt comment, and I think what I would say is that if one takes psalms such as some of the ones that I recited, which are not in themselves lament psalms, and I can't think, I would say Psalm 65, which is a lament, it's confession of sin. I think Psalm 65 is very apt for what you're talking about. It ends with humans falling silent as the fields and the flocks are offering, are singing out to God, with the fields bedecked with flocks. I don't think there are psalms that of lament. Oh, there is. Psalm 36. Psalm 36. Adamu v'chema toshia. Human and animal, and as you know, behema is generally domestic animals. And Psalm 30, human and animal, you save. It's the same word that's used for, God of my salvation. Adonai Yishi. It's probably the clearest statement in the whole Psalter of God's equal mercy for human and non-human animal life. And that Psalm 36 seems to be reflecting a situation of a land takeover. Very similar to what you see in Micah, for instance. Again, the picture of a small farmer having land grabbed, as we know happened repeatedly. This is kind of what the prophets are on about to a very great extent, as Israel itself moves not to anything on the scale of modern industrialization, but is moving to ascent away from subsistence-level agriculture to a crown-controlled agriculture. And so latifundialization, the small farms are getting gathered into wide estates to pay off political and military debts that the king might owe, and so on. So, and many of those, as I say, are laments. So that would be, in the first instance, the small farmer feeling the oppression, and yet, as Psalms like 65 and 36 and 104 indicate, human life and non-human life, animal life, are inseparable in the ancient world. I mean, people lived in the same house, literally, as their animals. The Israelite 4-room house, there's one room where the people are sleeping, and then the barn is not separate. It's the same building, essentially. That's pretty intimate. I mean, and of course, this is why, not to put too fine a point on it, this is why you have, in Leviticus, you have laws against bestiality, because people are living intimately with their animals. That doesn't make sense in an industrialized context, but it does make sense in where all of these creatures of God are living in immediate proximity to each other.
Okay,
I guess I had more to say than I might have thought.
A couple of questions from our online audience. First,
I am somehow not seeing you. Well,
I'm
thank you.
all
Okay.
the way here in the back.
Okay.
I'm speaking on behalf of somebody outside the room, so
I see.
it doesn't
Thank
matter
you.
anyway.
Thank you.
So the first question, is it likely Gerard Manley Hopkins also drew from the Psalms in his poetry that collapses distance between prayer and nature?
Oh, I think so. Certainly Gerard Manley Hopkins is reading Psalms daily. Some of you would know much better than I about his own spiritual practices, but it's inconceivable to me that he's not steeped in that thought world. And of course, that's part of what he is lamenting the loss of the losses that are coming with the dawn of industrialization.
Yeah, thank you. Another person is...
I'll just mention, if I may, another poet who I think much later, 20th century, Patrick Kavanagh would be another poet who I think is steeped, Roman Catholic, and who is steeped, I think, in that intersection, like Hopkins.
Great, thank you. Another person is curious, are there other contemporary women poets and writers that you're engaging with?
I'm not widely learned in poetry, but for some of these concerns, I think Jane Hirschfield, another Californian, a little local boosterism. That's the first person who's coming to my mind right now.
Great, thank you. One more. Person asks, where would you put the death of an individual human being in the context of this reflection that you've offered?
The death of an individual human being?
Yes.
This is really off the top of my head, but I am going to venture a guess that every person in this room could think of someone they know whose life has been curtailed or damaged by environmental degradation. And so it's, that's the way if other things don't touch us, that touches us. And we know that all these things are tangled up together.
Other questions or comments?
Thanks for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. I
Thank
want
you.
to ask a version of the question I was going to ask, and that is, do you think there's a kind of method in your approach to the Psalms in which you begin with something in contemporary poetry, especially these two women, that touch you, and then you are inspired to see something similar in the Psalms? In other words, instead of beginning with the Psalms and applying the Psalm to something else, you begin with either a thought or a poetic process that leads you to a Psalm, and to see a kind of pattern or process in that Psalm that you want to let the Psalm elaborate.
I'd say it's a chicken and egg thing. And because I knew that, I had grown up with the Psalms, so I hesitate to say I know the Psalms, but I've been steeped in them much longer than I've known the poetry of these two people. And at the same time, the fact that I gravitate toward these people, I'm sure is not incidentally connected with the fact that I'm steeped in the Psalms. And then when I'm teaching, I often tend to do exactly what you've just described, Father Clifford, that I'll pick Psalms, and then I'll often, set them just alongside. I'll pick a poem, and then I'll set it alongside Psalms. So it's, it's back and forth. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think in your talk early on, you mentioned that I think it was your students have a hard time reading poetry, or you were adverting to the fact that poetry can be hard.
Yeah.
And yet the two, I would say that the two poets you chose are more accessible poets. My question is really about the Psalms. How accessible would the Psalms have been to early hearers of the Psalms? I'm just trying to, what would the pitch or the level of accessibility be vis-a-vis, modern poetry, which can be very difficult? These ones are relatively easy, though.
So we're going to talk about Psalms rather than about these two. Okay. Some Psalms, not all Psalms are created equal. Some Psalms are tougher than others. That's also, to some extent, a hard question for me to answer, because I don't know any speakers of Iron Age Hebrew. So I'm guessing. And there are different idioms represented. I will say that translating the Psalter was, for me, probably the hardest thing I've ever done. And there were times, more than a few times, when I thought, well, nobody knows what this psalm means, or this section of a psalm means, and so I get to just pick which way I want to be wrong, because there's really no hope of being right. And some of the psalms are perfectly clear and straightforward, at least linguistically so. But then it's also the case that, I had a very interesting conversation with a group of contemporary dancers today over Psalm 27. And so I read it to them in Hebrew and translated it. And one of the dancers said, this is just a whole lot more open than the way I normally hear the Psalms. And she was someone who has some familiarity with Spanish, and it pointed out that English, well, back and forth, we sort of pointed out to each other that English style tends to connect phrases or clauses in a very clear way with a lot of subordinating words. Whereas, while, therefore, on the contrary, all these things. Whereas Hebrew favors paratactic style and sets things side by side, and you figure out how they're connected. So to say how clear they would have been, I don't think clarity and ambiguity are I don't think there's a strict dichotomy between those two, that something can point in more than one direction, even if it's kind of clear. So I made some reference to Psalm 65, L'cha dumiati la, to you, silence is praise. Now, to me, that appears very clearly what the Hebrew says, but as I say, and Robert Alter too, but as I say, most translators move another direction. Now, there are a few different Hebrew roots that Dumia could be reflecting, so I'm not saying they're flat wrong. And if I were an Iron Age Hebrew speaker, would my mind go in those several directions? Quite likely, I don't know.
Last question, anyone? Right over here.
Thank you very much for your lecture, and thank you for the introduction to Ann Porter. It's new to me.
Yeah.
The title of your lecture puts us in mind of both care and loss. And as I reflect on what you've shared tonight, I think the balance is perhaps more toward care than loss in the poets, especially the contemporary poets that you brought to our attention. And I'm just curious how, as you think through their work and through your biblical scholarship, where you would point us to think with loss, perhaps more pointedly.
Well, I did include with each of them some of those. So are you asking particular poems?
Or just perhaps there are images. I mean, I'm familiar more with Mary Oliver, and I think those loss images are sometimes very prevalent, especially in her later work. Certainly personal loss, not so much related to nature or creation, but just if there are images or poems that really kind of point you in that direction from either of them.
I probably don't know the body of either of them. It's been a while since I've sort of worked through a lot of their poetry, so I don't have a very satisfactory answer to that question. But I think you're right about Mary Oliver. And actually, I think of both of them. I would say their primary aim is to make us care more. And so that's probably why I leaned that direction in here. It's also Easter season. But there's, for all of them, including in personal, both of them write about personal loss. Ann Porter especially with reference to one of her 5 children. And there's an element of, who predeceased her, and there's an element of heartbreak that's quite clear with her. She did not have an easy life. And you certainly hear that in Mary Oliver again in the later poems. So that's not a very satisfactory answer.
All right, well, this concludes our event. Please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you.